Good afternoon and welcome to this meeting of the Urban Development Subcommittee, Tuesday the 8th of March. I will just start with karakia. Tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki waho. Tuia te hira tangata, ka ronga te po, ka ronga te a, hui e, takie. Thank you and welcome everyone. I haven't received any apologies and I think we have all members of the subcommittee here. So that's fantastic. Thank you. The order of business, we are being live streamed, of course, and shouldn't have to, but you know, if we need to vote, you can use your pluses and crosses and things like that. But it's a small meeting, so we should be able to keep it a little less formal. So order of business will be as per the agenda. Are there any updates to the interest register? We've got no decisions to be made today, so then there'll be no conflicts. And so accordingly, I will go to the public forum. We have Zola Rose from Common Ground, who is here to talk about inclusionary zoning and land availability. I did see Zola here before. Okay.
She's in?
Yes, Zola is here. Welcome, Zola, to this meeting of the Urban Development Subcommittee. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you. But feel free to leave time at the end of what you've got to say for questions.
Great. Thank you for inviting me. Kia ora, everyone. I actually have a PowerPoint presentation I have prepared to help us to go through what I'm presenting. So I believe somebody will bring that up on the screen. Yes, if it could be shown as a slideshow. Yes, that's wonderful. Great. Yeah, please let me know if you cannot hear me. So my presentation today is on enabling affordable, connected, and regenerative living in Nelson by developing a tiny home community / eco-village. I'm Zola Rose, and I'm the director of Common Ground. Next slide. So who am I? I've been a resident of Nelson since October last year, and I currently am seeking an affordable house to own within an intentional community. I'm the mother of 2 young adults. I currently am researching enabling collective housing for women. I established Common Ground in 2019, which is a social enterprise for building the capacity for community-led housing. It's also known as collective housing, which is affordable, connected, and sustainable communities. I have a master's degree in community development, a certificate in regenerative development, as well as eco-village design education and permaculture design. When I was living in Hamilton, I helped establish the Waikato Community Lands Trust to facilitate affordable housing. And I have served as a board member on the Housing Innovation Society and the Society for Cooperative Housing New Zealand, both here in Aotearoa, from 2019 to 2021. So I'm quite passionate, as you can tell, about housing and to be able to build the capacity in our country to enable more collective housing, specifically where people can help themselves to provide their housing solutions. Okay, next slide, please. So my idea is a tiny home community and eco-village. So the reason why a tiny home community eco-village, the first value is around affordability. As you know, housing, we have the most expensive housing in the OECD at the moment. So a tiny home is a way to own a home for a quarter to a third of the price of what is a conventional house. A community provides shared amenities and resources. If land is leased rather than bought, that also keeps the house affordable. Ideally, the land in this community would be held by a trust, like a housing trust or community land trust. And the structure of the the entity of the community would be in the form of a cooperative with some homes being available to rent. So that's basically a nonprofit entity that helps to govern the community. Next slide, please. Okay, connected is the next value. So why community? Well, it would be an intentional community of people aligned with the values of caring for the earth and for each other. It would be people living there committed to Nelson and to adding value into the wider community. The neighborhood would be designed to create social interactions, and there would be common facilities such as a common house, laundry, tools, workshop, and gardens. So that creates more connection. Next slide, please. And it would have a focus on sustainable and regenerative. So it would be stewarding the land on which the community is situated, offering workshops in land care, permaculture, composting, and etc. It would be linked to educational institutions to learn and share research. It would be using of appropriate technologies and renewable energy, and it would be in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. So just to why I use the word eco-village, I'm a member of the Global Eco-Village Network for Australasia, Oceania. And so they're specifically in the Global Eco-Village Network defined as places characterized by striving to take a systemic approach to integrating the human environment with the natural environment. Thus, eco-villages aim to develop green buildings, grow organic food, use renewable energy, create a strong sense of community, use participatory governance system, and teach what they are learning through practical hands-on methods. That's from a woman living at Ithaca Eco Village. And this photo is Narara Eco Village in Australia. Next slide. So I've gone onto the council's website and I see that this idea of a collective housing, tiny home, eco-village fits within council priorities of having urban and rural environments that are people-friendly, well-planned, and sustainably managed, that communities are healthy, safe, inclusive, and resilient, and the council provides leadership and fosters partnerships, a regional perspective, and community engagement. Also with the priorities being on the environment and housing affordability. Next slide. So this project, because it is a collective housing and with a regenerative principles, we are seeking partnership and collaboration in whatever way possible with the Nelson City Council, with landowners, Nelson Tasman Housing Trust, other housing organizations, the Climate Forum, NMIT, a tiny home company that builds to code, local employers or organizations that need housing for their staff, iwi, and other. Next slide, please. So considerations for a pilot to test out this idea. It would be to form a cooperative as the nonprofit entity, which would guide the project, to collaborate with local organizations. It would be a showcase of how an affordable, connected, and sustainable housing community can look. It could be on a short-term trial of 3 to 5 years if the land is leased in order to test the concept. It could be a combination of tiny home on wheels and relocatable homes, such as that which is being done in the Mohua Affordable Housing Project in the Golden Bay. And it would create a light footprint for infrastructure, which would be able to make use of land for food and ecology, and thereby being able to make use of rural land. Next slide. And possible land, I have just had a very brief look at what would be possible. So these need more exploration, but I'm looking at the Mai Tai Valley Campground, Tahuna Nui Campground, the Brook Valley Holiday Park, any other unused council land, land around the Montebello Avenue and Yafatu Bowling Club, taking a long lease with landowners, or a possible partnership with the Kaka Valley development. So these are all really just ideas that I've put out to explore. Next slide. And again, this is just an example of what a tiny home community could look like. With any piece of land, really, it's working with the design, the contours and what is existing on the site already. But this is just to show that it would be done using ecological principles, being able to have some common facilities like with a common house and other shared workshop space, with each house having a little bit of space around and common ground in between. So again, just an example of what could look like, probably not exactly like this given the, the nature of where the land is, but okay, next slide. And then I have inquired about inclusionary zoning, and so I'm just tacking it on to the end because it is a way to be able to make more land available for housing and or money available for affordable housing. I'm not going to go too much into detail because I believe it has been brought to council to consider, but I did raise a question as to why it is not yet adopted for the city. So just to go over quickly, inclusionary zoning programs are local policies that tap the economic gains from rising real estate values to create affordable housing for lower income families. An inclusionary housing program might require developers to sell or rent 10 to 30% of new residential units to lower income residents or to give the land to the housing. I believe this is a very effective way of making land or affordable housing more readily available with limited government or nonprofit funding. The Queenstown Lakes Community Housing Trust has built hundreds of houses using this inclusionary zoning policy, and I'm just inquiring as to where it sits right now with the Nelson City Council, what people think about the idea and how it could be used in our region to make affordable housing. So next slide. And that's just an end slide with my contact details. So I can make this presentation available as a PDF. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. So I'm available for comments, questions.
Thank you very much, Sola. We've just got a couple of minutes available for questions. So I'll just let you know that in regards to inclusionary zoning, it was recommended that it needs to be approached from the national level because in some of the individual communities who've progressed it or tried to progress it, it's been subject to a lot of appeals, quite an expensive and protracted process. And so with the reform of the RMA, there's the opportunity for it to be looked at that central government level. And so Nelson City Council has supported that inclusionary zoning should be looked at as part of those RMA reforms. So it's there somewhere in the central government toolbox. The RMA reform is, of course, quite a major project, but it is one of those things best done at that central government level, so then it can feed down for all of us.
Yes. Oh, thanks for updating me on that.
Not a problem. Okay, so did we have any questions for Zola? Look, it was great having those slides. Really appreciate that because that made the presentation quite clear. I read, of course, in the paper last night about the Takaka co-housing project that sold all but one. Must admit, I was a little dismayed to see the price tag was $699,500. I don't quite think that fits into affordability models. I think affordable is still classified as around the 600, 650 mark, but you know, with how the prices are going, but yeah, still.
Well, I do know that they're going to be making the third neighborhood of 33 houses on a community land trust, and they're using some of the proceeds or funding from the first two neighborhoods being developed to be able to make the land trust in that third neighborhood really into affordable housing. I mean, the other thing around affordable is it's actually 30% of a household's median income. So that would have to be people earning a lot of money if they can afford 600. But yeah, so that's how they're using the community land trust model for affordable housing, but it's a funding issue. So that's why they're doing it in the third stage.
Okay, I've got a question from Mel Courtney, Councillor Courtney.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your presentation, Zola. You gave us an example or a photo of a tiny home village in Australia. Are you familiar with that particular one?
Narara is an eco-village. It's not a tiny home village. There's actually really
Oh, it's an eco one. Oh, I see.
villages. Yeah, it's an eco-village, and I am familiar with Narara, and it's actually doing quite well as a community.
Yes, I wondered. So where are you wanting us to consider Nelson region? That's your objective?
Yes, I'm in Nelson, and I know there's a bunch of other people living in Nelson that are struggling to afford to live here. I've spoken to a lot of them. Well, I should say in my own circles of people that I have connected with, there's folks who've expressed dismay at the cost of housing and being able to stay here to contribute to the community, but they actually have to consider either moving farther away or just moving completely out of the area, which would be a shame to lose them because they are contributing quite a bit to the local community.
And just a final one, what contact have you had so far, or is it just a bit premature, this question, with local groups? I'm thinking particularly of our Nelson Tasman Housing Trust and other community groups that are in the housing area.
Yeah, I've made initial contact. So I've spoken with Kendra of the Housing Trust, and she thinks that they could be a partner in the future. If I have a feasibility study put together, like a little business case, they would be interested, because I originally said, oh, maybe we need to set up a community land trust to be able to take land out of the market and make it available. But she said, well, start with the Housing Trust because they already are established. Maybe they would be able to channel some funding or hold land or something. So yes, it's all very much in the initial stages of investigating and starting those relationships. And I haven't met with anyone else from the Housing Trust, but the executive said to set up a meeting with her. So I'm, going to be doing that shortly. And Habitat for Humanity, I've tried to set up a meeting with them as well, just to see what their interest might be in the tiny home idea. And I've met with Ian McComb, who's got a company called Small Time Developments, and he's also interested in the tiny idea of intentional community with tinier homes.
Oh, good. You're moving on that. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one quick last question because we've only got a 1 hour meeting slot. So we unfortunately can't take it all up with public forum. So Brian?
Yeah, quick questions. Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Zola, for your presentation. You talked about building to code, and I'm assuming you mean that the buildings are still subject to the requirements of the Building Act, and more importantly, our local bylaws in terms of connection to things like water supply and wastewater in particular.
So the code was specifically for the building itself. I found a tiny home builder that does build to building code. Now, the thing about it being an eco-village or being slightly off-grid is that that's one of the things we'd need to look at. What kind of appropriate technology could be used? For instance, I mentioned Ian McComb. He's got some ideas. He's an engineer and a water specialist, looking at ideas around waste, water, and energy, localizing those 3 services as much as possible. So again, it depends on the site, where it is, and what might be possible. I'm quite familiar with many different alternative technologies that would allow for that to be more localized instead of tapping in to the mains. But again, it would need, according to where the site is, to be investigated.
Okay.
Thank you, Zola. I'll need to leave it there. Zola has put up her contact details, and of course they'll be shared to councillors if anyone would like to follow up with her directly. So thank you very much for coming in today, Zola, and for your presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to meeting with any of you who would like to meet with me further on this.
Okay, thank you. So we'll now move to confirmation of the minutes. They're page 5 to 7 of the agenda. Unless there's any corrections, have I got someone who would like to move them? Moved Mel, seconded by Pete. All those in favour, just raise your hand. Great, that's carried. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll now move to the chair's report. I'll just basically acknowledge that today is International Day of Women. And just note that women face systemic barriers to housing. They have higher rates of poverty. They are 5 times more likely to actually live in poverty, particularly women who need to leave partners and become single parents, and also that women are often forced to make decisions between staying in domestic violence situations because they don't have alternate housing options. So it's a bit of a sobering note, but it's a bit about why we're doing what we're doing, why housing is so important. It is not just a need, and it's not just a nice to have. It is actually a human right, and international human rights law does acknowledge the right to housing and the right to safe and secure home, and where they can live in security, peace, and with dignity. And I think that's critical. We've had some great changes in the rental laws to make sure that they come up to healthy home standards, but I still think there is quite a long way to go in improving things for renters and in ensuring that we're doing more in the housing space. So thank you everyone for joining us today for this really important mahi. And yeah, with the emphasis today on women, just because it is International Women's Day. So it's a verbal report, so I don't need a mover or seconder. And so I will now move to Ellen Gray, our program lead for city development. And Ellen's got an update on the city development program. And I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Ellen.
Yeah, kia ora. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see everybody back again. I think it's the first time we've seen each other since December. And kind of excited to bring you guys up to speed with an update on the City Center program. So I can bring the slides up, or I don't know if the government advisors can bring them up. Let me know, I can do it myself. But with that, I just a little bit since the adoption of the of Te Aroha Whakatū in December. Oh, thank you. I had a nice long break over Christmas and have been back into what are our next steps since adoption of the plan. And these slides that we'll go over is just about 7 of them. And if we can go to the next slide. This is over 2 different, I guess, capital expenditure codes that the city development team has regarding the city center. The first is an area of budgeting around CBD enhancements. This budget is looking quite hard at the Bridge Street Linear Park, or as we're referring to it in the IAF, the Linear Active Transport Corridor. So to enable to meet Kāinga Ora's development program, we're going to need to move into this space with some schematic and preliminary work kind of immediately. So Lisa can speak a little bit more about when we expect to hear about our application for Bridge Street. But what we're doing right now is developing a design brief and starting to get into some scope and some early discussion around procurement to get a team in place to enable some of that front end work. Whether or not we're successful in the IF application, the work will be really good to have. We can start to come back in and engage some of our stakeholders in this area and provide good faith to Kāinga Ora that we're moving forward to the program. So there's a few bullets that talk about what those timeframes might be. So we're going to develop the brief and procurement over the next couple months, and then move into the schematic optioning, which we should have probably June or July. And the scope of that work is going to look at the length of Bridge Street from Rutherford Street to Collingwood and include Lower Haven Road, and then crossing over to Anzac Park as part of that schematic work. Once we find out if we're successful in the actual application, then we can get into further detailed stages of that. So we've had some discussion with our senior leadership team, and they're pretty comfortable with this approach. The second piece of work relative to the CBD enhancement budgets is work that we've discussed and consulted a bit in our 10-year plan around the city center play and play space. And so we know that there's a strong passion from our community to see something come forward in this. We are going to start to work with a range of different teams in the organization to start to look at this in a more focused way. Do we consider purchasing a piece of property to create a space? What is the role of play in the city center as compared to something that might be just sitting outside the city center? And then we need to look at the Riverside pop-up park that we've had in place now for about a year and a half. And I think that there's a verbal agreement to commit to that for another 12 months. So we're looking at all that comprehensively, and what will happen in the play space or in the play area, we'll know more probably about mid-year. Next slide, please. And the next sort of tranche of, I guess, budget that we have is was confirmed from council in September 2020 when we were at the completion of I guess, discussions over the Streets for People work that we were looking at as part of Waka Kotahi's Innovating Streets program. And one of the commitments out of that was budget, but it was really prioritizing the completion of the spatial plan. So with completion of that, we're starting to look at what the potential, and the key word is potential, what the potential program of these sort of Streets for People tactical pilots could be. And while I have a series of sort of colored dots on this aerial plan, these are not definitive projects. And obviously over the next 2 or 2.5 years with respect to the budget that's been provided, these might very well change. And obviously we want some flexibility to be able to work with opportunities in our commercial or our development sector to find those opportunities. So next slide, I'll come back to some of these, is what is the process for these projects? And so what we're looking to do over the remainder of this financial year, over the next probably 4 months, is develop a sort of program. We need to understand what those potential projects are. It's going to be really key to find those sort of business or commercial, kind of, I want to call them partners in kind. I think the budget will come from us. We want to make sure we're not just doing this on our own, that we're working with our local business community to make sure these projects are supported. And then how we sort of develop those further is around a sort of let's find if we need a project manager, if we need designers in that space, and I'll talk about that in a second. So there's a sort of design and fabrication phase that might be 4 to 8 months, depending on what the project wants to be and what the intention is and the complexity. And then another period where we implement it, and another after that where we monitor it. And there'll be key milestones coming back to this very committee for feedback on that process as it goes forward. And for each project, you want to make sure you're evaluating it. Do you need to change it? Do you need to remove it? How can that sort of lead to, an idea of what success can look like? So that's kind of a simplified linear, timeline, and it could be we might have to repeat some steps and things given the nature of the work. Next slide, please. So that's the process. This is who we work with to do it. So obviously we work with this subcommittee, and we work with our SLT. And then what's really key right in the middle of the page is a sort of working group. And that would be made up of a number of, teams across council, but also I think a key business partner, again, that is touched on. So we're not just doing it on our own, we're having good support. And then we work within an already established supplier panel that's at the bottom that kind of help us be able to move quickly to come up with solutions. Next slide. And these are a little bit of an expansion over those sort of first 9 colored dots that you saw in the aerial plan. And a range of these are really quite interesting. So this idea of a Nelson Grief Forest, which is really a microforest methodology where you can create intensified planting in a relatively small footprint, is something that comes back to support the sort of greener streets kind of nature, or this greener city that we're trying to create. Now, this is an application that local artists, Katie Pascoe and Annie Pokel, have submitted to central government. And I don't know that that's been announced yet, but that stage that they've applied for, the stage 1 funding, would enable them to go to the community to have a discussion about what this type of grief forest could be, where are the locations it could be appropriate. And I'm really interested to support and help that. And we're going to be working with council's parks team and also the arts team to make sure that this comes to something that works for all of us in our strategies. The middle 3 dots are around our Streets for People. So Trafalgar mid-block is something we talked about prior to receiving this funding. We don't have a partner in that space yet, so that's something we want to actively engage with. And we know that a lot of the businesses have been focusing on other things right now. So we're hoping as we move through this wave of Omicron, we can come back and find those opportunities and explore those further. We have had discussions with Keegan Jeffries with the Bridge Street Collective and Kirby Lane about doing a small sort of linear parklet on Bridge Street outside of Kirby Lane. So there's some interest there. And I've had really initial discussions with Lisa at Arden and Portavia about something on Hardy Street. So those might be type of ways that those dining activities can further activate our streetscapes. Initial discussions at a very, very high level on 23 Halifax Street. So this is the upper right bubble. And right now it's great the farmers market's in there one day a week, but are there opportunities as discussions with the library program advance that site can take on further activations that can happen more through the week? So we really haven't explored that yet, but there's, it's kind of a page holder. Next slide. These are the last three. Church Street Laneway, I really want to come back to Church Street. Obviously, I've had questions from a lot of counselors and public about what we're doing there. The image you see would not be a sort of Streets for People tactical intervention. It's more of what we have in our spatial plan, but as a sort of long-term permanent type of response. But what could be the opportunities working with Church Street to create something as a pilot there that we can do sometime in the next probably year and a half? So we haven't started that exploration yet, but we're really interested in engaging with that. The next one in the middle is Saltwater Creek Laneway. So we've had some initial approach with Gibbons to possibly reopen the gate at Warehouse that's been closed since about the time the Briscoes and Rebel Sport have been opened. And obviously there's been some issues with antisocial and some other things there. It'd be interesting, and especially if we're thinking about building more intensified housing not far from this area, that can link in better to the parks and some of the things just outside of the Warehouse towards Hastings Street. So could we look at ways to open that up and provide some sort of a temporary way to activate that, working with some of those property owners like Tizzetti's and Lee Woodman's studio. The last one is, the Parks team has, I think, received some funding from central government for the renewal of the toilet block in Market Square or in Montgomery Square. And it'd be great to think about how we can provide more amenity, especially for Market Day, that could go, in conjunction with that. So there's been some high level discussion I've had with the Parks team about that. And the last slide, please. Yeah. So I guess as a summary of all, I just sort of walk through, it's, we're a relatively small team with limited resource. There was a lot you just saw. How do we prioritize the work and the focus, and to a degree, the budget and spend? And I think from our point of view, we really have to prepare ourselves for the linear park, awaiting the IAF, but also starting to get our ducks in a row to be able to move fairly quick in that space. So, but if we commit to that, we might have to look at how we do the city center play, or even some of the Streets for People work. So do those become things that we delay, or do we bring in external resources to help kind of carry that through, with myself and the city development team maintaining some good overview. And I think with Streets for People, which is the 3A and 3B, do we get into the tactical work as we sort of discussed, or does some part of that budget get redirected into doing actual longer term implementation? We had quite a bit of comment through the spatial plan engagement process with different people that said, hey, I'm really interested in the vision. Let's just get on and do it. So there's some questions we need to look at for that. I wouldn't suggest that we redirect all of that, because I think there are great opportunities to work with business to do pilots that I think can lead towards how the successful vision for our spatial plan could be implemented. And then the last one is just really quick. It's just maintaining a role across our organization with urban design to make sure key projects, align with our spatial planning thinking and find ways to, optimize those outcomes. So thanks. I'm sure you might have some questions, but that's me.
Thank you, Alan. So just going back to the timeline, so some of these will come forward to the subcommittee for further development, but others are operational and will just be the work you're doing anyway?
Yeah, so, well, I'm going to keep the subcommittee in the loop on this. Certainly, it may not be in the small details of things, but I'll certainly bring through a program, especially with the tactical work. You may not need to get into a lot of detail, but I do have committee members sitting on that working group, so they can be involved at a more detailed level of those projects. Right now, I've suggested that could be the chair, but the chair may want to think other people in the committee might want to be part of that too. I want to keep that working group relatively trim so that we can move at some speed, but we're not likely to implement anything the remainder of this financial year. We really want to get into the planning, have those discussions, especially with those commercial interests when they're ready to have them.
Thank you, Pete.
And sorry, through you, I would also add to that we need to internally work out delivery of projects, etc. So that's a critical component that needs to be worked through, particularly
align them with any other existing infrastructure projects, etc.
Correct.
Lovely. Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Ellen. Great to see all these things. There's so many different facets to what you've given us today that are exciting. Just a few little comments. I absolutely echo the concern about the laneway between the warehouse and town. It was used a lot, and I think it's very frustrating that it's been closed off. Second point is a bit like Back to the Future, really. I'm kind of interested in what the plans were for Trafalgar Street. I think I can't see the slide in front of me, but there was one potential for a parklet in front of a food business to be confirmed. Is that correct?
Yeah. So through the chair, I think you want to find businesses who want to come out on that footpath and endorse a project like this. So I think especially right now, hospitality is something that's really looking to not just take advantage of our great weather, but find options for their customers, indoor or outdoor. So if we can, and I know there have been some new food openings on Trafalgar Street, including that middle block. So it's great to see some of that starting to happen. We need to start to get ahead of the curve and find out if there are more businesses coming in there, or the newer businesses, if they're interested in this and working with them to deliver those outcomes. Yes,
I completely support that viewpoint. Given the historical nature of what happened or didn't happen in Trafalgar Street, I am really concerned because town is absolutely dead. I've never ever seen the main street like it is before. I don't know when anybody else wants to comment on it, but if this is what the long-term scenario of living with COVID is, which, let's face it, may well be long-term, especially on a seasonal basis, we have to do something because it is absolutely dead. And if there are any initiatives in play at the moment that are meant to be encouraging activity in town, they're not working. They're just not working. The other side to that is on Saturday, when we work with a scenario which is completely pedestrian based, essentially through the market, it's absolutely bustling. So whatever, Alan, I completely support whatever it is that you want to suggest that it's going to increase pedestrianisation and the ability for people to come in and enjoy our town centre in a new and different way. Further to that, I'm intrigued by the possibility of the improvement to, well, am I right in thinking it was the Montgomery Square toilet block? Is that correct? The area around it. Can I make a plea that negotiations with NETA are entered into, that any improvements that happen in the market could include a space for performers? Now, I have spoken with Nita about this for decades. She's opposed to it. She's opposed to encouraging performers at the market because people crowd around performances and move the emphasis away from the market to the performers, which I can understand from her perspective, but from the perspective of town square / market / audience / tourism, cultural tourism, every aspect that we could look at in terms of wanting to encourage activity in our CBD, I think we need to consider a properly set up, little smallish performance space reticulated power, all the things that are needed to encourage people to come in and perform, especially at our Saturday market. And I'd like you to give consideration to that. Thanks.
Thanks, Pete. Mel.
Thank you, Jadine. It's great to see you, Ellen, and to hear what you've put before us today. It really does excite me. Good to hear. And I take from what you've said that linear park is the one that you're going to prioritise, and I totally agree with that, if I understood you correctly. But I'd like to see you do the pop-up park or the relocation of it in tandem with the Bridge Street linear park, because we can't let that pop-up park and all the favourable comments we've had just sort of drop away if we haven't got a site in the central city that we can relocate it to in a 12 months time when the lease runs out. So that, to me, those two are important. We're going to be watched very closely by the community as we establish the Bridge Street linear park, and we've got to do that so well, Ellen. So that's where I think our two priorities should be, and I just wanting you to confirm that, because that's how I read it from you. But look, the whole thing is exciting, and it sits very comfortably with me. Thank you very much.
So, Ellen, were you just going to confirm that?
Well,
linear park is indeed priority?
Yeah, I think that was in the slide pack. That is the priority. The play space is in the long-term plan. That was the one thing specifically in the city center that was in that. I know there are groups that are really eager to get into that space. In our discussions, even getting the 12 months is a big positive for us. And a lot of the pop-up park is contingent on what's going on with the negotiations with on the wider Riverside precinct with the library and other things. So we want to stay really with our finger on the pulse on that, and that's why I really want to get into the play space probably sometime around May to have those discussions with the parks team and other people to keep that on the front burner.
And the timeline for the Bridge Street linear park, have you got?
Yeah, so I think the schematic phase, which is looking at options, we're gonna try. We're doing the design brief now. We're hoping to get into procurements next month and get into that sort of initial scoping and preliminary schematic work probably May through July. Lisa can speak more to the timing we expect to hear back from the IAF fund. But if we are successful on Bridge Street, we're going to need to move quite seamlessly right into that, from the schematics into the concept, detail design, develop design, all that stuff.
And you're optimistic about the IAF grant application? You're sort of...
Yeah, it's amazing. I don't think they're getting very many. Well, Lisa can speak to this because I'm outside the loop with Kainga Ora, but I would suspect that they're not receiving a lot of proposals that are kind of city center focused, intensified with housing, and aligning with a plan like ours. So I think that would have to be exciting.
Good.
Thank you, Ellen. I'll use that segue to thank you for your part, and I'm just clock watching.
No.
Because I don't want to miss out on Lisa, and
right.
Lisa can pick up where you've left off. Yep, I can see Lisa here. So yeah, thank you very much for that update, and look forward to lots of activation, lots of action. I know there's the planning to happen first, but yeah, we're backing you. So Lisa, I will now hand over to you for your strategic housing update, and maybe if you can start with the IAF.
Kia ora koutou. I guess I agree with Ellen. It's been a long time since I've been on a committee meeting in Zoom. I feel a little bit nervous, but if the GAs have my PowerPoint, they could bring that up now. My first slide is actually about the Saltwater housing project, which then leads into the IAF. So I will be able to update you in terms of the IAF application. So if we just go on to the next slide. So just a quick update on where the Saltwater housing project has got to. The Saltwater are moving quite fast, and they've invested quite a lot of resources. They've created a project team. which has members from all over the country, really experienced people in terms of urban design, project management, engagement, and iwi engagement. And I'm on that team. We meet every 2 weeks. And so they are currently looking at going through the Kāinga Order business case process and looking at options development. They are looking at options in terms of different yields and different designs, and also the funding of the project, because their first construction estimates are quite significant, and there's a bit of a gap in terms of funding. So as part of that process, they're also looking to engage with development stakeholders and with iwi to seek a partnership in the proposed buildings. So the next step, and so there's a governance team as well, which Nikki Harrison is on, and they meet monthly, and they are really the sort of gatekeepers for the work that the project team does. We're doing all this options development and making recommendations, and the governance team then approves it to go through the Kāinga Order process. So the next step for that is they're taking the options and the funding proposals to apply for, which is a Kāinga Order decision-making group, for a decision in April. And so that aligns quite nicely with the IAF application that Council's made for the Bridge Street Active Linear Transport Corridor. We've had, after we submitted our RFP, they invited us to a meeting where we clarified some issues. I did try to squeeze them to see if they were going to give us a heads up about where we were in the process and how good they thought our application was, but they didn't really let anything out of the bag there. But we are meant to be getting notified in March and entering into negotiations in April if we are successful. So that aligns really well with the Kāinga Order housing development decision in May, and both Alan and Karina and the team at Kāinga Order were already thinking about how we will be able to work together to seamlessly integrate the construction of these buildings with the construction of the linear active transport corridor. I don't know if you want to answer questions on each topic as we go, because my next slide is on.
Rachel's got her hand up, so.
Kia ora, Lisa. Just in terms of the housing development, I do have some questions, but they kind of go to negotiation with parties, so they're not sort of questions I can ask in public session. So I'll just note that I do have some, but if we're talking around negotiations, obviously I can't ask them here, so I'll just hold them for the moment.
Okay, so what we'll do is...
Yeah, there is a Kāinga Order governance group that we set up as part of the resolution in December, and I haven't actually assembled you to have a meeting yet, but maybe that would be helpful.
That will be very helpful, but I'm sure the rest of the committee would also be interested in getting a broader update if we've got time today, Judine. I know you're really tight on time.
Yeah, so ideally we'll try and whip through the presentation, and then we can briefly go into confidential to discuss those matters. So I'll let you finish the presentation first, Lisa.
Okay. The next two slides are actually 30 and 40-second video clips that we prepared for the IAF application that I'm not sure that councillors have seen yet. And so if we have time, I can show them to you now. So we just want to go on to the next slide, and the link is embedded. So if you hit Control and hover over the blue link, oh yeah. There's another one coming from Anzac Park on the next slide.
Same one.
Got it there. That's it. Yeah, so you can see that we pulled out all the stops to make our application easily understood by all those considering IAF. We go to the next slide. So just an update on the housing reserve. So council approved the applications to the phase 1 of the housing reserve, or in the setup of phase 1 at the end of last year. So far, one of the grant contracts was signed before Christmas, and that project is underway, and the other one is still under negotiation. And my next task for the first half of this year is to create the policy around phase 2 of the housing reserve, the balance of the funds. I'm looking to have a committee workshop to get your feedback, possibly in April, and I'm also looking to use some of the learnings from phase 1 in terms of keeping the criteria open and simple. There's a lot of pre-apps and different types of development proposals and different syndicates that are bubbling away in the city centre and on the fringe. So there's potential for a wide range of different types of applications from different types of developers and syndicates to be considered under phase 2. And at this stage, I'm thinking that we would do that once a year, annually assess them on their merits. But as I say, I'll be holding a committee workshop once I've done a bit more thinking around how the policy could work. Next slide. And council also approved Traitorous Street to go out for RFPs before Christmas. So that we're now out in November and closed in February. Officers are currently evaluating the applications, and we'll be bringing a report to the 14th of April Urban Development Subcommittee meeting for your consideration. Next slide. And this is one example of one of the development proposals and ideas that are bubbling away in Nelson at the moment. And we've been approached by a group of people, including Richard Bradwick Lunder, the TS Talisman Sea Cadets, and they have also hooked up with Kāinga Ora and had discussions with Wakatū about the sale of the old library building, which was out for tender earlier in the year, but has now been pulled off the market because of the Stafford claim. But that syndicate is really interested in looking to redevelop the old library with the Sea Cadet unit building for mixed use residential affordable housing. And because there's so many parties involved, they have approached council and wondering if council would be interested in taking on some kind of a leadership role in facilitating, and not a master plan, but an early concept plan to help interested parties have more certainty and reduce risk in terms of what's happening in the public space around that site, It's a really well located site with a number of the initiatives in Te Ara o Whakatū, including the Laneway in Albion Square. I guess I'm just bringing this to your attention so that you know about it, seeking your feedback in terms of whether or not we do want to take a leadership role, but also pointing out that we do have limited budget. There isn't really a staff resource allocated to this, and there is this uncertain timeline due to the Stafford plan. So I'll be seeking your feedback on perhaps looking at this proposal in a bit more depth, or having some of those interested developers come and speak to the committee. And that is my last slide.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Right, so we've only got a couple of minutes left. We've got a few questions that need to be dealt with in confidential. Does anyone have any general questions before we pop into confidential briefly? Kate.
Thanks, Judine. I just have a general question or comment. Look, I love the visuals, and I'm really excited about the progress that you're making in that field of work. I would like us to be thinking about visuals which include food resiliency. If we're serious about intensification, we need to be thinking about how people can utilise their linear parks for more than just shade and enjoyment. So I'm sure that will connect into the urban greening strategy as well, but maybe Lisa and Alan, you could check in with Den and Rosie and Paul and Bernadette in terms of how they can complement each other.
Okay, thank you. Matt.
Thanks, Judine. How many, sorry if I missed it, but how many Totoro Street applications are there?
Maybe that's something we can discuss in confidential.
Okay, thank you.
Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Judine. Just the question of the Talisman building, the Sea Cadet building. Are there any considerations with, is there a special designation that one? Is it for defence or for training purposes, something like that we need to work through?
Yes, there's a lot of complicated land issues in that area, not only the Stafford Plain, but that land that TS Talisman Sea Cadets on is owned by DOC and is leased for defence purposes. The parties that are involved in this potential development proposal have been having discussions, and they have found a pathway through that, which I won't outline here, but it is long and detailed. Yeah, no, I had a conversation with Chap a couple of days ago on exactly that issue. So obviously the discussions are open. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Pete.
Well, I similarly wanted to have a wee discussion about that site, but I think it might need to be in confidential.
Okay, so to discuss the any ones that are subject to commercial negotiation, it's the reason, GAs can correct me if I'm wrong, but it would be section 48(1)(a). Would be the matter would be likely to result in disclosure of information for which good reasons exist under section 7. Therefore, the particular interest being section 7(2)(i), being to enable the local authority to carry on without prejudice or disadvantage negotiations, including commercial and industrial negotiations. Is there any other resolutions we need to cover that? Looking to perhaps you, Claire?
No, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, and the specific matters of discussion will be the reserve fund, KO, and NMIT. Okay, so I'm happy to move the resolution. Is someone happy to second? Thank you, Pete. All those in favour? Okay, that's carried. Thank you very much. We'll just wait a moment while we go into confidential.
Through the chair, could you just give us a minute to stop going live?